This chair looks like it's had a hard life. I'm going to try to clean it up as best I can. It'll never look new again, but that's okay. I just want to clean off the years of neglect, give it some new life, and make it look like somebody has cared for it. I began by stripping the old finish. I'm using Citrus Strip, and as usual, I apply a nice wet coat. And just wait until it looks like the finish is starting to lift. And then scrape it off gently with a scraper. And once all of the stripper and finish was scraped off, I went over it with a dry piece of 4/0 steel wool, and this picked up most of the residue that was left. And then after that, I used some steel wool and mineral spirits just to give it a final cleaning. I removed the screws from the back, intending to take apart the assembly, but turns out it was glued together as well as screwed, so I just left it. But I was able to take off the whole assembly from the bottom and just work with it like that. When I turned the chair over, I noticed that the placement of the legs wasn't symmetrical. Nothing really lines up with the center line of the chair. But when you turn the chair over, you don't notice it unless you're really looking for it. The bottom edge of the backrest had some damage. Couldn't tell if these were dents or scratches or gouges, but if they were dents, I might be able to steam out the dent. So I first wet down the wood with some water and then took a small piece of rag. This is just like an old t-shirt, and wet that down, and then took a soldering iron and just gently applied some heat to the damage. And it did seem to raise the wood fibers a bit, so it was less noticeable. And here's the chair seat after it's dried from the stripping process. And you can see the dark and light areas. The dark areas are where the finish was still on the chair, and the light areas are the spots where the finish wore away. So I want to try to get the color a little more consistent, and I'll do that by sanding it. But this is plywood. The entire chair is actually made of bent plywood. So I want to be careful not to sand it too much and go through the plywood. So I just used some 180 grit and just slowly sanded by hand until it looked like it was starting to even out the color. And of course, by doing this, I was then lightening the whole seat, which was going to make it lighter than the rest of the chair because I wasn't sanding the rest of the chair this much because it didn't need it. So then I needed to match the color of the seat a little more closely to the rest of the chair, and I did that later on by first applying a couple of coats of shellac, and then some walnut gel stain. But since the wood was already sealed with the shellac, the gel stain didn't get absorbed much, which is what I wanted. So it just darkened it just a little bit and helped it to match the rest of the chair. There was a scratch on the seat that went across the grain, and when you wet it down, you could see that the edges were black, like they'd absorbed dirt probably, and it was very visible. So I wanted to try to reduce that a little bit. And the first thing I did was just to fill the scratch with some wood filler. But even after doing that, you could still see the edges, the black edges. So I took some of these dry pigments and mixed them in some clear lacquer until I had a color that came close to the color of the wood. And I just took a small paintbrush and just painted it onto the scratch just to try to hide the black edges so it wouldn't stand out as much. You could still see that something was there, but it wouldn't be quite as visible. I also applied the lacquer to the spot on the leg where I had to use some wood filler. Once the sanding was done, I took some clear shellac and I just wiped on a couple of thin coats onto the whole chair. And this will help to seal the wood so that it won't absorb as much of the top coat, which is going to be polyurethane. And that way I just won't have to use as much polyurethane. And once the shellac was dry, I wiped on some satin wipe-on polyurethane. And this is oil polyurethane. And I'm not using any stain on the chair, except for that little bit on the seat that I mentioned earlier. So it's just this clear finish. And then the chair was done. And here it is back in the sun. Thanks for watching.